Okay, good afternoon. So let me tell you a story. About 3 years ago, one of my colleagues pointed out to me an editorial that appeared in Science. And it said that essentially that NIH policies represented a threat to medical innovation. This editorial was written by Michael Rosbash from Brandeis University. And he wrote that with pay lines now at 10 to 15%, many truly excellent laboratories were being driven out of business. And in the spirit of never waste a good crisis, this would be a good time to do a serious look at NIH extramural policies. And in particular, he said that we need to focus on centers and other large collective funding efforts, as well as expensive clinical and epidemiologic research. So this was pointed out to me, and of course our reaction was, thank you very much, we're doing just fine. Then, about a month later, this paper appeared in the British Medical Journal. And this was a paper that was written by people both at NIH as well as outside NIH that suggested that half of clinical trials funded by NIH do not see their main results published within 2.5 years. Many trials never see their main results published at all. And our reaction to this was we simply could not believe it. After all, at a session like this at the AHA, many of our trials get presented, get published, get presented with great fanfare, and we thought that the methodology here wasn't quite right, and we hoped that this would go away. And then a month later, this appeared in my inbox, and it was, Dear Mike, could you please help us compose a response to this letter? This is a letter from Fred Upton. Fred Upton is a very important person in our lives. He is the chair of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, which is the committee that oversees the NIH. And this letter is addressed to the Honorable Francis Collins. It is written in response to this article that got published in the British Medical Journal, and it starts with, "We are writing to express our concern." You don't like getting letters like that, and the letter went downhill from there. And the end of the first paragraph said, "This letter raises concerns about whether NIH is doing its job." So we decided, and I must give enormous credit to my colleague David Gordon, to take a look at this question about how well we were doing in our role of funding clinical trials. So about a year, one sequester, and one government shutdown later, David published this article in the New England Journal. This came out almost exactly a year ago, and I'd like to point out that David actually won an award from the Secretary of Health and Human Services for career achievement, but this was cited as being one of a particularly important accomplishment. So this looked at 244 clinical trials in cardiovascular medicine that were funded by NHLBI and completed over a 10-year period. And this is what was found. So first, what we did was we split the trials up into two kinds. Those that focus on clinical endpoints, so clinical endpoints would be death, myocardial infarction, or stroke, and those that focused on surrogate endpoints, like change in blood pressure or change in a biomarker. And what we found was that those trials that focused on clinical endpoints published very quickly. So the x-axis here shows the months after the trial was finished, after the data set was locked, and the y-axis shows the cumulative publication rate. And what we see here is that about 2/3 of the trials were published within 1 year of completion, and essentially all the trials were completed within 2 years of completion. And that's great, but the only problem is that was only 45 of our trials. That was only 20% of the trials. Most of the trials, 80% of the trials, presented a very different picture. After 1 year, only 10% of those trials were published. And after 2.5 years, fewer than 50% were published. So we effectively replicated the results of the BMJ paper. And this led to an editorial, a very thoughtful editorial written by P.J. Devereaux and Salim Yusuf, in effectively saying that if NHLBI is going to fulfill its role, it has to ask this question: when it comes to trials, do we get what we pay for? And the answer was, well, sort of yes, but sort of no. And they go on to say that to the extent that trials with these features, meaning a focus on clinical endpoints, are more reliable and better suited to inform clinical care, research funders need to rethink whether the current preponderance of research funding awarded to small clinical trials is a good return on investment. In other words, maybe we're not really doing a good job of fulfilling our role of funding the best science. Now, the problem with clinical trials could be thought of as part of a bigger problem. Here was another editorial. This was written by Jim Langer, the former vice president of the National Academy of Sciences. Points out that the system that we have for funding biomedical research is failing. And the reason why it is failing is that it was designed to function well in a state of continuous growth. But we're not in a state of continuous growth. We're in a state of continuous contraction. So what do? So he says here the funding agencies must admit that it is not humanly possible to predict with high accuracy which research projects ultimately will have the most impact. And when there are too many of these, which is the current case, the agencies must find other ways to decide which to support. That will be hard. Thank you. Now, along those lines, another very interesting piece was published earlier this year by Bruce Alberts and colleagues. Harold Varmus was also one of the authors in PNAS about the systematic flaws that currently bedevil the U.S. biomedical research system. And they said very much the same thing. The long-held but erroneous assumption of never-ending growth has created an unsustainable, hyper-competitive system. The problems cannot be solved with simplistic approaches. It is time to confront the dangers and rethink some fundamental features of the U.S. biomedical research ecosystem. Well, in order to think about whether or not we're fulfilling our role properly, we have to think about impact. How does one assess the impact of research? And this is not easy. Now, here was an interesting way of thinking about this that Johnny Anitis and Moon Khoury published earlier this year. They call it the PQRST approach. P is productivity, Q is quality, R is replication, S is sharing, and T is translation. And we've actually started to look at some of these, and in effect, looking at whether or not our trials are publishing their main results would be one example of a measure of productivity. But when we think about this, thinking about measuring the outcomes of research and the impact of research, it is amazing to think, and this was nicely pointed out by John Ioannidis, that we are spending billions, in fact tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars on research, and yet we do not know the best way to allocate that money. The treatment of hypertension may be evidence-based, and we may argue with each other about what the evidence actually means and how we interpret it. But the management of grants, the way we give out money to fund research, is not evidence-based. It is remarkably evidence-free. And John has gone so far as to say that this is actually a scandal. But at the very least, what it means is recognizing that our system is failing, we do have to consider other business models besides the one that has essentially carried NIH and a lot of biomedical research funding for the last 50 years. So this brings us now to a key idea, which is that NIH does not act in a vacuum. NIH is not isolated in the funding of research. These two articles appeared a couple of years ago in JAMA. The first one called Facing the NIH Funding Crisis, How Professional Societies Can Help. These authors were from the American Society of Hematology. And then an accompanying article, Biomedical Research in an Age of Austerity. And one of the key points that both of these articles made is that we need to work together with our colleagues in the professional societies to make things work better. And let me just quote from this. This is from Moses and Dorsey, and I thought this is really beautiful, and it's very apropos to the project that we're talking about today. Federal funding for biomedical research is unlikely to increase. In fact, it will probably continue to decrease. New private sources of support are needed. Public charities and private foundations are vital, both for their financial sponsorship and their ability to organize new approaches. Biomedical research must look to the private sector and not the federal government as the source of new funds. Now, here's one way of thinking about how NIH might work with the private sector. As many of you know, both professional societies that we work with, the AHA and the ACC, have sunk a lot of money and developed these beautiful registries. And these registries have produced beautiful data on huge numbers of patients. So here's a project that we funded as part of the stimulus bill, looking at outcomes of patients with complex coronary disease and the type of revascularization they underwent. This study involved 200,000 people. It only cost us a few $1 million. Effectively, what NIH did was it leveraged the outstanding work that the professional societies had done, and it leveraged their investments to enable an outstanding project. In a way, what's happening here with the CVGPS project is perhaps the opposite, and I come up with this term called CounterLeveraging, where the American Heart Association is leveraging the investments and the work of the NIH, and it is a form of sharing. The way you can think about this is that the AHA has seen the resources that we have developed in Framingham and Jackson as being so valuable that they are investing a substantial sum of money to enable researchers to share that resource and use that resource to do some outstanding science. And the goal of this, as Nancy Brown very nicely said, is to plot the best route to health for each and every person. But I think what's also very cool about this is it's an example of where the professional society is leveraging the investment of the government to share that resource and make it possible to come up with a whole new way of thinking about how we fund research and make some great things happen. So let me conclude about question is, what is the role of NHLBI? Well, the obvious thing that we can say is to fund the best science, but in a way that doesn't really say very much. What's better, a better way of saying it, is that our role is to enable the best science, to make it possible that the best science can be done. Now, what's not so obvious is the need to question assumptions. The need to say, you know, maybe the way that we've been funding research for the last 50 years is not the best way to go about doing it now, especially in an environment where we're seeing continuous contraction of available resources. We also need to measure impact. We can't assume that just because the fact that we're doing it and our scientists are doing it, that it's necessarily good. And I think the case of clinical trials is a nice example of that. We need to consider alternate business models. And in effect, what we're doing here is a tremendous experiment in a different business model of funding research. And the theme, perhaps, of what we're doing here with the AHA CVGPS project is that we're not going it alone. We are sharing this, not only sharing resources and biology and specimens and data and scientific knowledge, but we're also sharing this problem of figuring out how best to fund biomedical research. And hopefully by doing this, we'll make this place a healthier world. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that terrific talk, Mike. Are there questions for Dr. Lauer? Yes. Yeah.
Could you use the microphone, please?
Yeah, that'd be great.
My name is Robert Ripley. I'm from Nashville, Tennessee. I'm on the CMS Innovation Committee, and we just finished a PCI project. It's very nice. We looked at outcomes. We looked at cost, all of which came from insurance companies and Medicaid programs. My question to you is, there's lots going on in this Innovation Committee that really isn't scientific research. It's more cost effectiveness, but they're backing into what's evidence-based medicine that justifies cost. Would you be willing to expand your model further to work with CMS to look at cost effectiveness type research, the linkage of cost with quality care, or would you be willing to go that far?
So we have, and I must give Francis Collins an enormous amount of credit for this, because he's been working very hard on developing strong relations with CMS, and I've had the privilege of being part of that. think one thing that CMS has done that's particularly admirable is coming up with ways to make their data more readily available, and more readily available at substantially lower cost through an entirely different business model than what they've used, so that it's possible for us then to fund CMS-based research and be able to do it at substantially lower cost. Now, the business model has been that if we're going to fund quality research, we have to pay people to go to CMS and spend a lot of money so that CMS can create a data dump for them. And that seems kind of inefficient. And so now what they've done is developed these enclaves, making it possible for people to get access to vast amounts of data at substantially lower cost. And so what we're hoping that this will do is make it possible to fund many more types of health services research and quality type research, and be able to do that at lower costs and get some more insights.
Yes, Jeff?
So I think we would all agree with many of the points that you've made, and we all recognize that it's an age of austerity. But I keep coming back to the idea that the NIH budget represents such a small amount of the total U.S. national budget, and the amount of additional funding that NIH might be able to develop that could have a huge impact is just not that much money. So my question is, are there any prospects for increasing the NIH budget to a point that would really have a big impact on the community and on the output without necessarily running up against, you know, all of these other constraints that we have in the age of austerity?
At this point, I'm going to speak as a private citizen and not as a representative of my agency. That, you know, how much, so you are right that the total amount of money from the federal budget that is spent on science is about 1%. That's all science, so that would include energy and defense. And so we're a part of that. So we're less than 1% of the overall federal budget. The decisions about how much money gets spent for discretionary spending, those decisions are made on Capitol Hill. Those decisions, and what we have to do is we have to figure out how to make best with what's actually there. I think what's critical now, and I'm just speaking now as a private citizen, is that people really have to be engaged. Imagine if 100 members of Congress were participants in our epidemiological studies or our clinical trials. Imagine if instead of having only 3% of Americans participating in clinical research, it was 30% of Americans participating in clinical research. If that's what was going on, then they would be hearing a different message. And it comes back to a great line of Abraham Lincoln, which is that it all boils down to public sentiment. If the public sentiment is with you, you can essentially do anything you want. And if the public sentiment is not, you can't. So I think our fundamental problem here is that fewer than 10% of physicians participate in research of any kind, even enrolling one patient. And fewer than, as I said, fewer than 5% of Americans themselves participate in research. So there's no interest in research. I mean, really, that's what the issue is. Now, you see in a few places, like, for example, the rare disease societies have done some incredible work where they have really rallied their troops. The pediatric cancer folks have really done a great job of rallying their troops. And that's the kind of thing that needs to happen. That will change the world.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Lauer. Appreciate it.
Not the official view of my agency.
Yes, we understand.